There is one technique in modern warfare that requires no large-scale offensive, no thousands of soldiers, and doesn't make headlines right away. It works quietly, methodically, and by the time the enemy understands what is happening, the trap has already snapped shut. This is precisely the technique Ukraine appears to have applied near Armyansk, and it may be the one that changes the logic of the entire southern campaign. More than 160 recorded medium-range strikes. Over 65 ammunition depots and logistics hubs hit. Dozens of drone control points, workshops, and command posts in the Russian rear destroyed or damaged. This was not a random attack on a random road. It was a strike against a system, the very system that keeps Russia's southern war machine operational. Fuel tankers, ammunition trucks, military transport vehicles, support vehicles. All of these reportedly fell within the strike zone. But to understand why this matters, you first need to understand how Russia ended up in this situation at all. After Ukrainian strikes put pressure on other crossings, near Chonhar and along routes through northern Crimea, Russian columns were left with fewer safe paths. Armyansk became more important, which meant it became more vulnerable. If a reconnaissance drone was watching movement from above, a column could be identified while still on approach. Once the target was confirmed, strike FPV drones could be directed toward the road along which Russian supplies were moving into Crimea. The threat to Moscow was straightforward. If those vehicles reached the peninsula, fuel and ammunition would continue flowing to the troops, primarily in the Zaporizhia direction and across the entire southern front. But if the route could be slowed even briefly, Russia's entire logistical rhythm would begin to falter. It is important to grasp the scale of what is happening here. This is not about one bridge or one column. It is about how Ukraine is attempting to shift the course of the war without resorting to a large-scale ground offensive. The real question is this: did Ukraine simply strike a Russian column? Or did it expose how Russia's own rerouting decisions had turned Armyansk into a logistical trap? Armyansk was not a random target. It became one element of a broader Ukrainian operation aimed at making Crimea harder to supply, harder to defend, and impossible to use as a reliable rear staging ground. As pressure on other crossings increased, the northern border of Crimea took on new significance. Roads that had previously looked like ordinary military supply arteries became narrow gateways. Chonhar, Perekop, Armyansk. These are no longer just names on a map. They are points where Russian movement can be tracked, delayed, and struck. For Russia, this created a growing problem. Crimea still needed fuel, ammunition, spare parts, radar equipment, air defense missiles, engineering units, and reserve forces. These supplies had to keep coming, because the peninsula is not merely a symbol of occupation, it is a military platform supporting operations toward Kherson, Zaporizhia, and other sectors of the southern front. Ukraine has long-range systems capable of striking deep targets: airfields, fuel facilities, command posts. This is precisely why the campaign around Armyansk makes systemic sense. It was not designed to set a bridge on fire. It was designed to disrupt the system operating behind the Russian front line. The pressure built gradually. When one crossing came under threat, Russian planners were forced to reroute. When the next route became too risky, transport was funneled into narrower corridors. Columns that had previously spread across several roads were compressed into a single stream. Each individual decision was logical in isolation, but taken together, they created a pattern that Ukrainian intelligence could study and exploit. This is the essence of what is happening. Ukraine was no longer only choosing where to strike. Russia was increasingly being pushed exactly where Ukraine was already watching. Russian commanders once had considerably more space in the rear, room to position depots, move trucks, organize troops. That space has now contracted. Russia attempted to protect key routes with radar coverage, electronic warfare systems, air defense positions, and guards at crossings. But a protected road can still become a trap if too many vehicles depend on it. Air defense controls the sky, but cannot clear a traffic jam on a road. Electronic warfare jams signals, but does not make a damaged crossing safe again. If movement slows, every vehicle behind becomes part of one shared problem. Here is the hard lesson of modern logistical warfare. Ukraine does not always need to destroy every bridge or every truck. Sometimes it is enough to make a route unreliable. This is why Armyansk became something more than just a point on the road into Crimea. It became a test of who controls the rhythm of movement. For Moscow, the problem is not one drone or one burned-out vehicle. The problem is uncertainty. If every depot in the rear is potentially under surveillance, every column requires more careful planning. And if this pressure continues, the real damage will not appear in a single explosion. It will appear in slowed columns, long detours, extended repairs, and frontline commanders waiting for supplies that should have arrived earlier. Now, on how the operation near Armyansk actually unfolded. Russia likely directed more traffic through this node, not because it wanted to take risks, but because pressure on other crossings left fewer viable options. Logistics officers still needed to maintain the flow of supplies. Fuel had to reach Crimea. Ammunition had to reach units in the south. Repair vehicles, trucks, reinforcement equipment could not simply stop because one route had become dangerous. The war machine requires movement, and movement requires open roads. This is where Armyansk became critical. It sits at one of the northern gateways into Crimea, through which traffic from Russian-controlled territory in southern Ukraine can move toward the peninsula. When other routes were damaged, under surveillance, or too dangerous for regular use, Armyansk could shift from a backup route to the primary corridor. On a map, this looks like a minor detail. On the ground, it changed everything. The first signs of pressure would not have been dramatic. One column ordered to depart later than planned. Another group of trucks directed to use a different road. Vehicles that had previously moved in small groups consolidated into a denser flow, because commanders wanted to push supplies through while the route remained open. Each decision made sense on its own. Together, they created a pattern that Ukrainian intelligence could study. For the crews of the column, Armyansk may have looked like a path towards safer ground. The drivers saw a road, a crossing, and the prospect of reaching Crimea. But a narrow route changes the value of every vehicle within it. A truck carrying shells is no longer just a truck. A fuel tanker is not just fuel on wheels. A repair vehicle is not just support equipment. If all of them are funneled into one corridor, they become linked targets. A reconnaissance drone operating above the area could track movement from above. At first, the picture might have looked like ordinary military traffic. But then the pattern could have become clearer. More vehicles entering the same area, some heavier than standard transport, others moving like support vehicles. The drone did not need a perfect image of every truck. It needed enough indicators to confirm this was not a small patrol or random movement, but a logistics column moving along an important route. This is what may have changed the significance of Armyansk at that moment. The initial pressure on the area may have damaged a bridge or slowed a crossing, but the column gave Ukraine a considerably larger opportunity. If the vehicles reached Crimea, their cargo could move deeper into the Russian system. That meant identifying the moment of maximum vulnerability for the column, the point where movement, terrain, and traffic density were working against it simultaneously. This is the power of modern drone warfare. Not only in the strike, but in the waiting. A drone can turn a road into an information screen. It shows which vehicles are moving first, which are falling behind, where the column is beginning to compress. That is the moment when even a limited number of strike drones can produce a disproportionately large effect. According to Ukrainian data, approximately 50 Russian military vehicles were struck or disabled in the Armyansk area. That is a significant figure. But the more important question is what mission those vehicles were carrying out. A logistics column is only useful if it arrives at its destination. If the road was blocked, the mission failed, even if some of the trucks were left untouched. After the first phase of the attack, the response itself could have created new targets. Engineering and repair teams had to clear the route. Security teams had to cover damaged vehicles. Commanders had to decide, pull the column back, push it forward, or hold it in place until the road reopened. Each option carried risk. If repair vehicles entered the same narrow corridor, they became visible to Ukrainian reconnaissance. If engineers worked slowly, movement remained frozen. This is where the Ukrainian method revealed itself. Kyiv was not trying to win this engagement through a frontal strike. It was using drones to reach into the supply system behind Russia's combat formations. For Russia, every new adjustment costs more. A damaged bridge requires repair. A blocked route requires a detour. A delayed column requires rescheduling. If a vehicle burns, a replacement is needed. Even if the army keeps moving, it moves under greater pressure, with greater risk, and with less freedom of maneuver. And this brings us to the central question. If Ukraine continues pushing Russian logistics into slower and more vulnerable routes, how long can Crimea remain a reliable rear base rather than a permanent strike zone? The strike near Armyansk may go down as a warning signal for Russia's entire logistics network around Crimea. Ukraine is no longer hunting only Russian armor at the front. It is now looking deeper, at the roads, bridges, fuel routes, and supply columns that allow that armor to keep fighting. In the weeks ahead, Russia will likely attempt to repair damaged routes, reinforce air defenses, strengthen electronic warfare, and shift columns onto smaller bypass roads. Ukraine, in response, will likely continue conducting surveillance with reconnaissance drones and striking with attack systems at the moment movement becomes predictable. The question remains open. Is Russia adapting quickly enough to protect Crimea's logistics network, or is Ukraine methodically turning every remaining route into another trap? Write your thoughts in the comments. If this analysis was useful to you, leave a like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel. We continue to follow how this war unfolds, clearly, without unnecessary noise, and grounded in facts.